Let me welcome you all here to the Hudson Independence Forum on News, titled Invasion of the Truth Snatchers, American Journalism in the Age of Bubbles, Tweets, and Fake News. The focus of this conversation will be, I hope, on the mechanics of journalism and the relationship between news organizations and the public. While we can have this conversation with making some reference to personalities and policies, I hope that we can concentrate more on the process of journalism and how it has changed in recent decades. We'll examine the changes that have taken place with the shrinking of what were once powerful news organizations and the fragmentation of the media. And yes, we will talk about fake news, what it is, whether it's new, how it's spread, and what we can do to recognize it and combat it. Let me introduce my panelists. I'm very lucky to have an interesting combination of very able, capable people. Mary Ratzenberger is the Executive Director of the Authors Guild and the Authors Guild Foundation. Prior to joining the Guild in November of 2014, Mary practiced law for over 25 years in roles that spanned private practice, the government, and the corporate sector, and is a recognized expert in copyright and media law. She lives here in Tarrytown. Bill Bruskin, on the far left there, is a professor of professional practice at Columbia University School of Journalism. He also served for 6 years as the school's academic dean. He's credited with transforming Columbia's curriculum in video and digital journalism. Before his academic career, he was the executive director at Bloomberg, overseeing digital platform training of the global news staff. Prior to that, he worked at the Wall Street Journal, where he was the managing editor of WSJ.com, the paper's website. He was named deputy managing editor of the paper, overseeing 14 domestic bureaus and combining print and online desks. And he's also a co-author of the book, The Story So Far, What We Know About the Business of Digital Journalism. And on my right is John Scott, the co-anchor for Fox News' Happening Now program. John was a member of the original anchor team at Fox. He covered 9/11 here in New York, and he spent time covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Before he joined Fox, he received an Emmy for news writing while at Dateline NBC. So welcome to all of you. Thank you. When I came of age and started my career in journalism, most people got their news from a handful of national big city papers, 3 news magazines, and 3 broadcast news channels. When pollster Oliver Quayle did a survey in 1972 on which politicians people trusted, he threw in one well-known non-poll for comparison. That was CBS's anchor Walter Cronkite. None of the politicians came even close to Cronkite in measure of trustworthiness, and CBS began touting Cronkite as the most trusted man in America. And that was in many ways a reflection of how the public viewed the media in general at that time. Recently, by comparison, several prominent television personalities were effectively banished from their organizations for sexual improprieties. A recent poll concluded that nearly half of us believe that reporters make things up about Donald Trump, a distrust that Trump promotes in his comments and his everyday tweets. In 1966, 65% of the people trusted government to do the right thing. After Vietnam, Watergate, and all the things that have transpired since, that figure is now down to 20%. A lot has gone wrong in so many ways, and I wonder whether the erosion of the news business is a leading or a following indicator of that. So I'd like Mary to talk a little bit about how you see it, what's happened specifically to the business of news gathering.
Thank you, Barrett. I just want to say I'm delighted to be here in my hometown. This is really fun. Let me first say, put out a proposition that journalism is in crisis today. And this is a really serious matter, something that we all should be talking about and thinking about, because nothing less than democracy is at stake. So I want to thank Barry for organizing the panel. As James Madison said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who need to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. So in other words, This is something that, as we know, the founders spent a lot of time thinking about. For this democracy they were creating to be successful, they needed people to be educated. They needed the people to be informed. For this democracy they were creating to be successful, they needed people to be educated. They needed the people to be informed. Journalism, that's where journalism comes in. So I'm going to give you some statistics about the state of journalism today and how it's changed in the last few decades. First, I'll start with ad revenue. I'm going to focus right now not on the fake news aspect, but the economics of journalism. Total ad revenue for the newspaper industry in 2016 was $18 billion, which sounds like a lot. This is for the whole U.S. newspaper industry. But that is down from $49 billion in 2006. So a drop in 10 years of $49 billion to $18 billion. In other words, the newspaper industry lost 2/3 of their advertising revenue. Circulation is also way down. This includes online circulation of papers. Total weekday circulation for U.S. daily newspapers fell to 35 million, which this is in 2016 or 17 also, down from well over 60 million starting in the 1960s all the way through the 90s. So with the dawn of the internet age, we've seen circulation drop. We're at the lowest level since 1945. And of course, we're a much more populous country. So the falling revenues mean that papers have to make cuts or they fold. Newspapers, major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Post, they've all had massive layoffs in the last decade. I think the New York Times has had 6 series of layoffs and buyouts in the last 10 years. And the remaining staff is young, and I'd say they're underpaid. The number of jobs for reporters and journalists have declined. This is their salaries. As Barry said, I'm with the Authors Guild, and we spend a lot of time looking at authors' incomes, and they've plummeted, and a lot of authors are journalists also. So this is something that we care a lot about. But the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that newspaper jobs declined by 60% from 1990 to 2016. Okay, so from the dawn of the internet age until now. So there were 183,000 newspaper jobs in 2016 compared to 458,000 in 1990. That's a massive shrinkage. So it means that seasoned, even well-known journalists, people, bylines that you've read your whole lives, they're not necessarily working as journalists anymore. Or maybe they're working on a freelance basis. But it's very hard to make a living as a freelancer because freelance rates are down by, in many cases, 400%. The median income for reporters and correspondence employees is under $40,000 in 2017. So we're seeing newspapers cut. We're seeing some close. We're seeing some particularly local ones go online. Since 2007, 15 North American metro dailies have closed, and many others have been acquired by large media conglomerates. So why is this happening? What's going on? Well, there's a big move from reading the publications, newspaper publications themselves, to reading news on the internet. A recent Pew Research report found that 67%, or 2/3 of Americans, get their news from social media. 78% of people under 50 get their news from social media. So what this means is that the advertising dollars, the advertisers advertise where the eyeballs are, right? So they're advertising online. Their advertising dollars are going to Facebook and to Google. Facebook and Google now control 73% of all U.S. digital ad revenue. So what we're seeing is the mega internet platforms are literally draining the money out of the newspaper business. They also control the distribution, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, through secret algorithms. They choose what you see. There's no transparency in how they make those choices. They're taking much of the profit, and at the same time, they don't care about the content. They have no custodial care interest in what the content is, except for one thing, that it be sticky, that it keep your eyeballs on that page for long enough to serve you up ads and to get more information about what you're interested in so that it can target you better in the future. So what we see is a huge decline in the quality of news, not just the quantity. And some people say, oh, well, we're just in the middle of a transformation from print journalism. Sorry, I don't know what happened to digital, and that is not the case. This is not just a transfer from one medium to the other. It is a real disruption of journalism itself.
When I started at Time magazine back in 1971, we had whole phalanxes of researchers, and they were highly educated people who did nothing but fact check the stories that were written by the correspondents and writers in the magazine. Over the years, as the money got tighter and tighter, the phalanx got smaller and smaller. There were fewer researchers. More work was done, handed over to the reporters themselves to fact check their own material, self-check stories. And all this was going on at the same time that the news cycle. We were a weekly, we had a whole week in which to digest what had happened, make some sense of it, and turn that into news stories. That cycle kept accelerating from weekly to daily to hourly to nanosecondly, which is where it is now, all of which completely infringes on the capacity to fact check. So there is, in my mind, it's quite clear how a lot of this is happening with the disintegration of the accuracy that goes into the media. But let me hand this over to Bill, who's our expert on fake news and others.
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert, and I try not to actually create fake news, but I'm going to give you a shortened version of a much longer talk, and I know that you'll be grateful that it's shortened. But what I'd like to do is kind of tell you a little bit about fake news, give you some examples, both from years ago as well as the 2016 election, and then I want to scare the pants off of all of you when I show you what's happening with fake news in the next year or two to come. There's a bit of profanity coming up, so you're all going to have to I'm going to tell you exactly when it's coming, so you don't know what it's coming. So, we hear a lot about fake news these days, and before we talk about it, I'd like to just talk for a moment, and obviously we're going to have a Q&A later on where we can get into more detail about this, about what fake news and what fake news is and what fake news isn't. Journalists make mistakes all the time. Okay, I'll bet you everybody on this panel has made a mistake once or twice in a story. I made some mistakes in my early days in the newspaper business, but you'd have to go to the microfiche in the basement of the Baltimore or Tampa public libraries to find it, so good luck with that. But journalists get things wrong because you're on deadline, sources tell you something that turns out not to be right. You get the middle initial wrong, that's kind of embarrassing. You fail to figure out that the causes of the Iraq War are not what we were being told. That's a much bigger deal. Nevertheless, journalists get things wrong, but they don't do things intentionally wrong, at least good journalists don't. There are people out there who are doing things intentionally to humor you, to mislead you. They may have political motives, they may have economic motives. We'll actually go through a few examples. That's what I would call fake news. Now, a certain number of politicians like to call things fake news that are either actually true that they don't like, or that are wrong, but were wrong because a reporter just was in a rush or got something wrong. So that's the kind of basis upon which I'd like to have this discussion. But the idea that fake news is new is not right. Fake news goes back a long time. I'm not quite old enough to remember this, but in 1835, the New York Sun felt the circulation needed a little boost. So they had a 6-day series about that they had discovered life on Mars with the winged creature that you see here that looks suspiciously like man. And they claimed to have interviews with an astronomer who'd set up a super telescope in some wild part of Africa. The whole thing was total BS, of course, at least so far as I know. But it did its trick. It did boost circulation for a little while. About 100 years later, a lot of newspapers in the South started publishing stories about what they called Eleanor Club, named after the woman who was the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And the idea was this was during World War II. A lot of men, mostly white men, some African American, but mostly white men had gone off to Europe or to Asia to fight the Axis powers. And the idea was that black women were supposedly forming these secret Eleanor Clubs, which were designed to kind of take over or get higher wages, or make white women actually start cooking and doing laundry themselves. It was all baloney. It was totally made up, but the idea was this would kind of give them. Obviously, this wasn't done so much for economic reasons, but more they were taking these rumors that they didn't bother to check and that were obviously untrue and propagating them through their newspapers. You may have noticed a certain number of fake news stories during the 2016 election. I just want to give you a couple of my favorite examples. This is one where Pope Francis endorsed Trump. Many of you may not be aware of this. It was on a website called WTOE5 News, which sounds like a legitimate website. And that gets to one of the core things that I think, as Mary set up so nicely, the economic model of journalism has changed so much. The barriers to entry, that is starting a news site, are zero. You literally could sit on your iPhone right now during my boring talk, and you can set up your own website that would be instantaneously available to about 5 billion internet users all around the world. Okay? At the same time, if you can get a story going viral enough, which thanks to Facebook especially, that can be done with the right kind of mixture of craziness and that kind of thing, you can actually get a tremendous number of page views. So this actually got quite a bit of traffic. There was another one from a website called tnzhiphop.com that said Trump was offering free one-way tickets to Africa and Mexico for those who want to leave America. This is one of my favorites. It was actually something put out on Twitter. It was encouraging Hillary Clinton voters that they could vote by text, so they didn't even need to bother to go to the polls to vote. But this is my all-time favorite, just so you don't think all the fake news is conservative. This was, I believe this is not true, reported to demonstrate that Mike Pence. This is actually on a humor website, but somebody had picked it up and kind of broadcast it more. And here's one where, especially in light of today's news, the NFL is interesting. Obama had supposedly signed an executive order banning the national anthem at all sporting events. And the interesting thing about this one is it appears on a website called abcnews.com.co. And you'll notice it has a little ABC News logo. And if you've ever seen the actual ABC News logo, you can kind of tell it's not quite right. And if you looked at the URL in the browser bar, you would know that that URL doesn't look right. But how many people really put that much effort into kind of figuring out where their news comes from, which is a really important part of what we're going to talk about. This was one of the most serious fake news stories that came up during the election. It ran on a website called the Denver Guardian. I'm from Denver. I can tell you the Denver Guardian never has and never will exist. Well, I wouldn't say never will. And it purported to demonstrate, it ran on November 5th, 2016, which was 3 days before the election. It purported to demonstrate that an FBI agent who is tied to the Hillary email investigation had killed his wife and then himself and then set the house on fire. And I don't have time to go through the entire story, but it was written in a way that you would assume that the Associated Press had written it. A very kind of sober, kind of inverted pyramid lead, as we call it in the news business. And this story got over 1 million shares on Facebook. So it was viewed by millions of people. And so that brings up what is the real kind of bogeyman here, which is that news organizations, thanks to the trends that Mary talked to, no longer have control over the distribution of their content the way they used to. In other words, 20 years ago, if you wanted to watch something from CBS News, you had to watch it on CBS News, or you had to go to their website. Whoops, sorry. You can tell I am a print guy. I don't do broadcast. Nowadays, of course, stories can and will be distributed through many forms of social media, through Google, but especially through Facebook, which is, and I'm sure many of you have kept up with this, which is a company that has really accelerated. So this is a little graphic that was done by BuzzFeed, which has actually done some very good journalism around fake news. And what they did was they looked at what were the top 20 stories in the election that were fake, and what were the top 20 that were real. And by top 20, I mean which stories got the most engagements on Facebook. And what they showed was that from February until July, fake news vastly underperformed mainstream news. But you can tell starting in August, in other words, after the political conventions occurred, the fake news shares shot up to over 8.5 million, while actually they drowned out a lot of the mainstream news. So even if you think you're a fairly discerning connoisseur of journalism as we know it today, it's very easy. If you see a story that's been recommended by a friend of yours on Facebook that sort of has all the hallmarks of a real site to make yourself believe that that's actually true. Now, what I showed you were fairly crude examples of fake news, but fake news is really actually getting easier and easier to produce, and it's looking better and better. Just the other day, I spent a little time on a website called tweeterino.com, and I came up with this tweet, which looks just like a real tweet from Donald Trump, but Bill G is actually me, Bill Brewston. Okay? Adobe has a software, and I don't really have time to get into it, and it's actually how long, where you can take audio from a person, actually bring the audio in. The software will analyze the speech patterns. You need about an hour or two of audio, which, given most politicians, is not very hard to get, right? And then you can literally type new words in, and it will sound just like the old one. Meanwhile, at Stanford, they've created something called face-to-face, which is a way of making video appear like it came from a different person altogether. And that's where I'm going to get to this example that I hope will scare you. So this is a video that was put out. It was actually put out as kind of a joke. So as you'll see, it's pretty clear that this isn't really what you think it is. And you'll see little signs, but let me try to show it. Hopefully the sound will work too.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time. Even if they would...
Well, I'm sorry. The bit of profanity comes up in 20 seconds.
So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson was in the sunken place, or, now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time.
Oh, God.
Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become...
Sorry, that was... So with that, I will turn it over to Barrett.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. That's scary, all right. That's a tough act to follow, John, but you're the last man standing. You've been with Fox almost since the beginning.
Since the beginning.
And you've seen a lot of changes take place, but you're also there watching firsthand as Roger Ailes kind of built the strategy that he had in mind, and it's changed cable TV news profoundly, and it changed all news profoundly. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences and your reactions to that?
I started in local news, first at a station in Denver, and then Miami, then Inside Edition, then Dateline NBC, back when Dateline did more than murder stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I had died and gone to heaven, but ended up, for a bunch of reasons, not staying at NBC. I was hired 20th Century Fox Television, which is a different arm of the company, was trying to resurrect A Current Affair and clean it up, and they hired me to be their anchor. So they hired me for a 5-year contract, 2 years of which were guaranteed, and canceled the show 6 months later. So I was actually getting paid to stay home, which is pretty nice. I should be a much better golfer than I am. But my agent called me one day and said, Rupert Murdoch wants to start a new news network to compete with CNN, and they want to talk to you. And I said, well, I don't have to go, do I? She said, yes, you do. So I went to the interview with Roger Ailes, and in that first interview, I remember him saying, I've forgotten the specific number, but he was fond of doing research, and he said something like, I want to say there's something like 63% of Americans believed that the news they got on television was biased, boring, or negative. And with numbers like those, he felt that he could start a new news channel and knock CNN off within 5 years. MSNBC had not launched yet. I was at NBC when they were coming around and saying, hey, would you like to go to Redmond, Washington to join the staff of MSNBC? And I would say, what is it? And nobody knew. Nobody could give me a definition. Well, it's going to be kind of like the computer and TV news get married and have a love child, and that's what MSNBC is going to be. And for a long time, I think that was MSNBC's problem. They had all of GE's money and Microsoft's money in the early going. They're now no longer part of the Microsoft empire. But they never knew what they wanted to be. These days, I think they know what they want to be, and it's an open question as to whether or not that's going to work. At any rate, Roger said that he wanted to knock off CNN within 5 years, and I thought he was nuts. And I remember, I'd been at the channel probably a year and a half, at a time when we were not visible to anybody in Manhattan. I called my agent and said, you got to get me out of here because I'm about to turn 40, and this place is the cable news desert. But within 5 years, Roger had realized his dream, had knocked off CNN as the #1 news network, and we at Fox have been #1 ever since. Now, you may like that, you might hate it, but there are reasons for that. And part of the reason is that, to my mind, news has always sort of emanated from New York and Washington. And there's a great big country out there of people who don't feel that their attitudes are represented by the news that they were watching on television. And those are the people that have made Fox #1. And I've been there 22 years. Never thought I would stay, never thought it would be successful, but lo and behold, here we are. So, I have more to say about fake news and how it has changed the industry. I'm not sure that cable news, when I was a kid, when I was a young journalist growing up, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I wanted to work for the evening news. And that was my dream at the time, and that is a dying business. In another 10 years, will there be a CBS Evening News and NBC Nightly News? I doubt it. In another 20 years, will there be CNN and Fox News? I'm not sure. I think it's going to take longer to kill off cable news, but I think the penetration of the internet is going to do to cable news what it's doing to newspapers. And the 3 main cable news networks are going to have to fight for survival in the same way that newspapers are right now. That's my opinion.
John, since Trump came on the scene, the differences among the cable TV stations, but particularly between Fox and MSNBC, have become very pronounced, to the point where certainly in the primetime evening hours, you can turn on one channel and then switch over to the other, and it's as if you're looking at an entirely different world. A totally different set of stories, or at least the reverse image of it. Is that intentional? How is that handled at Fox? How much attention does Fox pay to what MSNBC is doing, or vice versa? Is it warfare between the two, or is, as some people claim, Fox simply being the #1 cheerleader for the president?
I hesitate to delve too much into what happens during our evening programming because it is our opinion block. And I'm out there in the middle of the day trying to do a straight newscast. But clearly the folks, let me back up and say that Donald Trump announced his campaign for president when I was on TV. So I sat there and we were under orders to, anytime anybody announced, we would take the whole thing live without commercial interruptions. And then, he wrapped up his speech and I was left to say, well, here's what you just saw. And I could barely contain myself because I thought we were being punked. I thought he was not going to actually announce he was running for president. I thought he would spend 20 minutes talking about what was wrong with the country and say he had decided not to run. So, I'm not sure I'm the best judge. You know, there are a lot of people in the country who believe, and I know some of them personally, who believe that Washington is a fetid sewer and that you needed a guy who had his own money and wasn't beholden to anybody to come in and drain the swamp. And for those people, that is exactly what Donald Trump is doing. And the Bob Mueller investigation and so forth is all just part of the deep state plan to knock him off. And you might laugh at that, maybe you support that, but those people have the right to the opinion that they have just as much as you do. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people out there, and frankly, they turn to Fox, who think that this president is not getting a fair shake in the media.
Leslie Stahl, just in the past couple of days, recalled that after her 60 Minutes interview with Trump when he was first nominated, when they were off the record, she asked him, now that he's won the nomination, would he stop bashing the press as part of the strategy? And he said, according to Leslie Stahl, no, I need to do this in order to weaken the opposition for it and keep my credibility alive. So, Bill, back to fake news. Is that strategy working?
I think it's certainly working on one level. I mean, Trump's ratings have improved a bit, and within the Republican Party, he's as popular as almost any Republican president can expect to be. I think 88%. But it obviously is a limited strategy too. You know, it doesn't work at all with Democrats, and it seems to turn off a lot of independents, a lot of people of color, a lot of women, although there's a lot going into that. I would say the mistrust of the media didn't start when Donald Trump went down the escalator. I mean, if you look at the ratings of credibility of journalists over the last 25 years, it's been on a fairly steady slope downward, with a few blips up. But whether it's the Iraq War or Jason Blair, who was a young reporter at the Times who made up a lot of stories the Times acknowledged they did a terrible job of managing them, or a number of other things, or just the general climate in this country where we tend to hive off with people of our own political persuasion. It's been on a fairly straight downward slope for 25, 30 years, I think, something along those lines. And if anything, under Trump, it's actually kind of credibility of the press actually bumped up a little bit, at least among observers.
Because
I think people, well, first of all, I think people were a little bit complacent about the value of journalism, and I think technology companies tended to foster that. I've been to several Silicon Valley conferences, and you all may have as well, where the technologists would say, we don't really need journalists because there's all this information out there. We'll create algorithms that will sort through it and raise the stuff that is most important and relevant to you. But as we saw in the 2016 election, algorithms can go either way. And when they go badly really wrong with pretty dire consequences.
Right. Mary, maybe you can start a discussion on how, if we can we fix this? A lot of things to grapple with, one of which is that decline in the trustworthiness of, the level of trust of journalism in general, which may or may not have to do with fake news. And the second issue is fake news itself, is how do you combat that? How do you recognize it?
Well, I have some ideas. So I'm a lawyer by training, so a couple of my ideas are sort of legal, but so the first thing I would do, and the journalists in the room may not like this idea, but it does, occur to some of us that perhaps journalists or news publications, anybody who says they are disseminating news, should be licensed. Lawyers are licensed, doctors are licensed, a lot of professionals are licensed. And one of the things you have to do to keep your license is comply with a code of ethics. Now, the journalists in this room, probably most journalists do already comply with these codes of ethics. You would learn them in journalism school. Any reputable journalist follows these codes of ethics. I think the Society of Professional Journalists has them, and there are two that are applicable to fake news. One is take responsibility for accuracy, verify information. And Bill, who teaches journalism, and I'm sure you talk about this in journalism school. And the second one is never deliberately distort facts or context, which is important. So if you were to license journalists or news publications, then if there were actual falsehoods, there were breaches of these rules of ethics, just like lawyers and doctors are subjected to some kind of process, and you can, lose your license if it turns out that there are a substantial number of these kind of violations. So that's one idea. Another would be to regulate the internet news as well as broadcast. Now, Canada has regulations that are administered by their Radio, Television, and Communications Commission, like our FCC, that prohibits broadcast licensees from broadcasting false news intentionally. Okay, to go to Bill's point, it has to be an intentional falsehood that's broadcasted. Broadcast TV and radio are actually regulated in the U.S. also by the FCC, and the idea is that if you make use of the public airwaves, then you have some obligation to the people, and you have to adhere to certain standards like decency, hence the bleeping out of certain words. And I think truth should be one of them. Now, there are some free speech concerns with this. I know this is something that's been talked a bit about as well as in Canada, but you make the bar high. It has to be intentional, and you have to prove intentional falsehood. There is an anti-hoax rule that the FCC has, but it has actually never been enforced, and it would go to that, like the kind of thing that you showed earlier about the people on the moon. So then the third thing would be a private solution, and that would be some kind of seal of good journalism, I guess, where an association would provide news organizations with a seal of good journalism, or whatever you want to call it, if they did comply with certain rules, and there'd be some kind of way to enforce that and ensure that the entities that got these seals were compliant. But it would basically be a seal of trust, so that as a reader you would know, oh, okay, that's real news. And also you could, perhaps get Facebook to say they would only post as news that had the seal of good journalism. So anyway, those are just some ideas. And then also one more thing, because I did hand it out, there is a bill that was introduced a couple months ago. The Association of News Media, there are 2,000 newspapers in the States belong to it. They actually got a bill introduced that would give them, news media, an exemption from antitrust, allowing them to collectively bargain with Facebook and Google. And the reason they need this is because Facebook and Google are monopolies. You can't not say yes to them, right? And we in the book business, we have this with Amazon. Publishers cannot really negotiate with Amazon because you can't survive if you don't deal with Amazon. So they believe that they could be both on the percentage of money they got from news, and also on the terms of sort of what news is, appears higher up in search results. So anyway, I think it's interesting, and if you think it's a good idea, go, call or write a letter to Nita Lowry.
These are the results of a Monmouth University poll from 2 months ago. More than 3 in 4 Americans believe that traditional major TV and newspaper media outlets report fake news, including 31% who believe it happens regularly, 46% say it happens occasionally. Add those two numbers up, 77% of Americans believe major TV and newspaper outlets report fake news. Now, here's what I'm getting to regarding your comment. 25% say the term fake news applies only to stories where the facts are wrong. So those are the stories you're talking about. Most Americans, 65% on the other hand, say fake news applies to how news outlets make editorial decisions about what they choose to report. And a plurality of the public, this is astounding to me, say that traditional news media sources report fake news on purpose in order to push an agenda. Now let me give you an example. I wasn't in the room for this, but I was married to the person who told me the story, so I guess you have to give me credit for that. She was, at the time, a senior executive at NBC, and a bunch of the big muckety-mucks, the nightly news producers, and I think the head of the network news division were getting ready for some high-level meeting, and they were making small talk ahead of the meeting. This was at the tail end of the Bush 41 administration. And somebody made some crack about Bush was going to lose to Clinton by a landslide or something like that. And, my then wife said, something like, yeah, but you got to love that Barbara Bush. And there was dead silence in the room. And somebody turned to her and said, no, you don't. And this is, these are the top level people at NBC News. So if you think that kind of thinking doesn't percolate down into the stories that get run on the evening news, I think you're kidding yourself. And I think it's reflected. Perception is reality, and this is the perception, that we in the media are deliberately pushing phony agendas for our own agendas.
One observation that occurred to me, Mary, on that, the notion of licensing, whether it's a formal governmental issued license or a private sort of good seal, is sources of news, especially on the internet, are absolutely seamless. From some 14-year-old in Romania to somebody who's producing these very professional pieces of fake news that Bill illustrated with. So how do you differentiate? How do you deal with a 14-year-old if you're going to license journalists? How do you keep their information from seeping its way in and being sucked up by the people who happen to happen to agree with it ideologically and therefore want to spread it themselves?
Well, they don't get the seal of approval, basically. That's... it's complex, but it would be, so you have your trusted journalists, right? Your trusted sources of news. There are going to be other sources of news, and at that point, you use your own judgment about whether to trust it or not. Now, Facebook has just posted a list of how you can know if news is fake or not. And it's kind of interesting because I think it's also their way of, even though, Zuckerberg is saying we take responsibility, he's throwing it back at the people and saying, but you figure it out. So it's like a 6-point, 8-point list of the things you need to look out for. And, those are things I think are being taught in school too. So,
right.
Yeah, so the 14-year-old, unless they're really ambitious, doesn't get certified.
Right. Bill?
So let me try to address a bunch of things real quickly. First of all, on the polls about trust, and I saw the Monmouth one, which is really scary. Whenever there's a poll that says, do you trust the media, it's almost always a very low number because almost everybody has some major media outlet that they don't trust. And so it's always interesting to look at when they break it down a little bit. Do you trust this news organization, that one? I don't know if Monmouth did or not. But I suspect if we ask this room, do you all trust the media, 77% of you would probably say not all the time. Or
Only the Hudson Independent.
Yeah. Right. In terms of Mary's licensing idea, I will say that as somebody who depends upon tuition-paying students, I love the idea of licensing the regime that requires a degree from a graduate school of journalism. But I do think it. I think it's, first of all, you're the lawyer, I think it would not survive a lot of constitutional challenges, but also the idea of if it's a government agency determining who's true and who isn't, we get into a lot of issues. But that said, there actually are a couple of organizations, one started by Steve Brill, who was the founder of the American Lawyer, and Gordon Krowitz, who was my old boss at Dow Jones, to do the ratings of various news organizations, large and small, on accuracy, verification, transparency, which is something that we haven't talked about a lot so far, but a lot of these news sites that you see, both liberal and conservative, are not very transparent about where the funding is coming from, so you don't really know who's behind it. So they're coming up with a rating system, and it looks like they're going to be working with Facebook in particular, and this is where we get back to Facebook, which as you probably gleaned by now, I blame for a lot of our problems. At the same time, because they do exert so much control over the fire hose of what most average Americans, and not just in America, all over the world, what people see about what's going on in their country, insofar as they could take those ratings and use them to kind of trigger changes in their algorithms, which would surface stuff from much more credible news organizations and downplay stuff from, the like Denver Guardian or something like that. I think that's where you start getting into it. I will also tell you very briefly, there's a program called the Literacy Program, the News Literacy Program, which was started by a fellow at Stony Brook University, now it's spread around the world, and the idea is to train college students, but now they're also working with high school students in kind of how to examine your sources of information for credibility, and just kind of basic things, how to distinguish opinion from news, which I think a lot of people probably don't understand. How to look at a URL and determine whether it's really New York Times or somebody kind of doing a phishing scam. And that movement is now spread. It's being adopted in Poland, Israel, South Africa. They put all their syllabi and all their course materials on the web for free. I encourage any of you to look at it. It's really, you just Google Stony Brook News Literacy. And it's really, when you think about, if you compare fake news to like drugs, you can look at the supply or the demand side. And we've seen with our drug war, when we try to control the supply, drugs still get in because a lot of people want them. And there's a certain cachet and appeal to fake news. And so if you affect the demand side, if you have a more educated populace who can discern things, it's much better. The idea that you're going to do that all by 2020 is unlikely, but nevertheless, at least part of the problem has to be looked at from demand as well as supply.
On that point, there's a study out of MIT, also in March of 2018, that found, it was a Twitter-only study, but Twitter and Facebook are similar in some ways. False news is 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth. It is perceived as more novel. And this was interesting to me. We hear a lot about bots, but it found that humans, not robots, are more likely responsible for the dramatic spread of false news. It took the truth approximately 6 times as long as falsehood to reach 1,500 people online.
All right, we're running out of time, and we did promise to let people ask questions, and there is a microphone right there in the center of the aisle. There's a gentleman right behind the mic, so I
began with a quote from James Madison, the second half of which is, a popular government without information or the means of acquiring it is the prelude to a farce, a tragedy, or both. With avoiding that in mind, I think every news person going back to Lowell Thomas through to Severide and Fred Friendly, and everyone else assumed that the public was going to demand of the news media a certain level of unbiased opinion because they had skin in the game. Have we arrived at a point in society where people do not have enough skin in the game to demand of the media the facts that they need to survive things like war and the economy? And would we be solving the problem by doing things like reinstituting the draft or having people serve in social services? in order to ensure that the public goes back to demanding excellence rather than looking at the media to provide it to a public that doesn't really care.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, there is a detachment that seems to be pervasive in society. We just don't have that much to do. Remember that book Bowling Alone some years ago, where we talked about the fact that people don't join the Rotary as much anymore. They don't have organizations that, and they're more passive. And I think that sort of fits in with what you're talking about. Any other thoughts on that?
It's a little off topic, but I'm a big fan of the idea of compulsory service. I was a Vista volunteer actually when I got out of college. I worked on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation for 2 years, and I learned a lot there that I never would have if I had just kind of gone right into, and I think, we do have a lot of people who are very tied to their niche, whether it's geographical or economic or racial or ethnic or religious. And, I know experience that my dad had serving in the Army. He was from a small town in Iowa and was exposed to people from all over the country and really changed the way he saw things. But that's probably not going to happen. For sure.
When I first started in television, and I saw first the finest in the men and the women that worked in journalism. I was a part of when the World Trade Center got knocked off. We were the only game in town because we had the uplink to provide news and information. So I saw how these men and women were getting accurate information out. Later, when I worked at Gannett, 9/11 hit, and I saw it again. So one of the things that I saw was that journalists were up against the clock. When I started, because I was on both sides of the coin, when a journalist would call me and ask me for a quote or some information, I would ask them, when are you filing the story? I'm filing it at midnight, at 12:30. Now when I get calls, it's, when are you going to file the story? Right now on our digital product. Because of that, we saw preeminent journalists like Mike Bronicle, Doris Kearns, who's a wonderful author and good friend of mine, make up stuff because they were under pressure. I don't think it was so much because they were malintentioned, but there was the pressure of what was happening in the media world. You mentioned Walter Cronkite. I was good friends with Walter and Betsy very early on. And when we had conversations about the internet, and this was in the early 90s, I said, Walter, where do you see this? Some looked at it, including him, as something that would augment television and print. Others, like myself, saw it as a direct competitive threat. And I think that's something that's really not talked about a lot. Because at the end of the day, because I was an executive, both in print and in television, it's a business. You mentioned eyeballs. You don't get the eyeballs, you're not going to be paying the overhead. So I'd like to ask you, where do you see, I know the professor, Sally, you deal with the legal, and John, you're on air talent. Where do you see that confluence happening in terms of what's the next iteration of what's going to be happening?
I have this simplistic notion that what was going to, the transition that would take place from print to digital news would come through the form of iPads or their equivalent. That when you went out and bought your iPad, you would buy with it a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, whatever it was, that would be built into the cost of the iPad. And that would guarantee the income that would flow back to pay for the journalism that would produce that. Seemed like a good idea to me, but I don't see that it's even come close to doing that yet. Although there were talks, and I know that Time Inc., back when there was a Time Inc., was having talks with the computer companies about doing just that sort of thing, but it never came to anything. Whether that's any individual's fault, I don't know.
I think we're going to see a continued splintering of news. I spoke to the CEO of the New York Times a few months ago and said, "Sir," he was right after they had just done another layoff. I said, "Sir, are you guys going to survive?" He said, "We will survive, but only a few big newspapers will survive, and that's it. So the rest of our news is going to come from these, smaller sources. All the more reason to have some kind of, way to know what's trusted news." I do want to also just talk about the tribalism and the echo chamber for a minute, which John, you brought up a little bit, because that's the scary thing for the future, and that's something that really does need to be solved. We do see, even the big newspapers all seem to have, with some exceptions, there are some exceptions, there is a choice about what they report on or not. I mean, I think we do see that, and this election told us that many of us in the big seaboard cities really didn't have any idea of what was going on and how people were feeling in the middle of the country, and certainly in parts of the country. And I know in the publishing industry, this has given New York publishing a moment to pause and think, why weren't we publishing more books about this part of the world? And I think the news industry is going.
Elegy and that.
Yeah, Hillbilly Elegy is one of the sort of few books. It's like we need to communicate more, know more about each other. We are, for better or for worse, one country, and we need to start sharing information more broadly.
Do you rely on the media to fix that, or do we have to rely on ourselves?
I think we as a people need to start taking a little more responsibility.
I think, the genie is sort of out of the bottle in terms of trusted news sources that people are really going to turn to, maybe with the exception of major news events, another 9/11, something like that. Remember when Bill Clinton went on the Arsenio Hall show and played the saxophone, and people thought the world had come to an end because an American president or presidential candidate, I'm not sure which he was at that time, was willing to do something like that. A couple of years ago, President Obama gave an interview to a YouTube journalist who, to that point, had been famous for floating in a tub full of Fruit Loops and milk, But she has a lot of eyeballs on her YouTube page, and the sitting president of the United States thought it would be useful to give her an interview, It's a new world based because of the internet, and I don't think it's ever going to be the way most of us grew up to see it.
The internet, for all the destruction it's wreaked, and it has definitely on a lot of legacy models, it has also provided ways for disenfranchised, hidden groups of people, or just people with common interests, to have their voices heard. I mean, I worked at the Miami Herald for a long time. When I first got to Miami, this was in '85, and already the Cuban influx was huge, but the entire leadership of the Miami Herald was white and male. And it was, a lot of Cuban Americans really felt, and I don't know if you remember this in those days, John, too, and they had good reasons for feeling that they had a radio station, the WQBA, where they would traffic a lot of conspiracy theories about Castro, but they also did a lot of news that the Miami Herald just didn't do. And I think, if you're a stamp collector and you're trying to find other people who collect stamps, or if you're really into coverage of the oil industry in West Africa, and you're trying to find sources of information, the internet has done a lot to enable that, and I think some of that's come at the expense of newspapers that try to be a one-size-fits-all shop. And so I mourn the day that any newspaper dies, but I think there have been some benefits that have come out of all that destruction.
But I was wondering if I could hear from each of you what you felt about the veracity of the movie The Post. Because as somebody who lived through that period and was sort of coming to my awareness of the importance of newspapers at the time, I had my own resonance with it. And I'm interested to know what you as professionals each thought about The Post.
Every Hollywood movie needs drama, and I think that there was an awful lot of probably overhyping the drama in that movie, which, by the way, was a Fox movie, so I should sing its praises, but you know, I just think I think it was a little overly dramatic, but the essential points are there.
Really, the drama is going on in Times Square, not on 15th Street Northwest.
Right.
There.
Okay. I didn't even see it, so I. Yes, ma'am.
So it seems like you haven't addressed the issue of fake news. And my question for you is, how do we bridge the gap between the people who feel like they are not being served by the East Coasters and the West Coasters and the major news organizations that live there and fake? How do we get that and fake news? How do we work around those two things? Because I feel like, you know, everybody's crying fake news, and it doesn't seem like we can't see eye to eye in any way, and we need to figure that out. As Mary said, we need to figure out how to talk to each other. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
3 sides to every story. There's yours and there's mine, and the cold hard truth. And I think when it comes to journalism today, that's somewhat accurate. I think it's important, and you know, I came armed with a lot of polls tonight, and I won't bore you with too many more of those, but the American people recognize that as well. They say, by and large, that you shouldn't turn to any one source for your news. You should read a multiple of sources. But the problem is that people are lazy, you know, and if you can get something from your buddy's Facebook feed that seems reasonably correct. I got something sent to me the other day. I'm a pilot and I, you know, watch a lot of aviation stuff. Guy's flying around in his very expensive aerobatic airplane, and the right wing falls off.
Oh, I saw that.
And he hangs on his prop and does some magical flying and comes back and lands the plane safely. And I'm like, whoa! And it was complete nonsense. It never happened. It was artfully faked. And, you know, I'm a journalist and a pilot, and I thought it was the most amazing bit of flying I'd ever seen. The good news is I didn't send it to him.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make a point to somewhere in between Mary and my perceptions of Fox News. I think that the media itself, there's a blurring of what's news and what's opinion. When I was growing up, I wanted to be Eric Severide, and I knew that I was watching him say what he thought that night, and I don't know that we know that anymore. So perhaps in terms of regulation, if we can have PG-13 movies and not for mature audience TV shows, maybe we can tell people whether they're watching a news show or an opinion show. Hannity is an opinion show, he's not a news show, but he didn't really own up to that until he had to. And I think it's important that we make these distinctions for people, that we're upfront about it, and that we, you know, if you're watching PBS or you're reading the New York Times, they will often say full disclosure. You know, this is a parent company, or this company funded something on PBS, and you need to understand this when you hear what I have to say. So I guess my point is there should be some way to codify that and to force broadcasters and or news media or any media to say, this is news, this is opinion, and I have an interest in this, or there's something that I need to disclose. Thank you.
Full disclosure. What's that? Yes. My niece is Jessica Tarloff, who works at Fox. She's one of the lonely Democrat pundits.
Love her.
Oh, she's great. She's really good, and she does it. But about 5 or 6 years ago, she wrote her PhD thesis at the London School of Economics, which found something. I really didn't like it. I was very critical of it, because she looked at the impact of scandal on the careers of British politicians. And she looked at the election of John Major and the election of Tony Blair, Labour and the Conservatives. And basically, she found after all this research that it had no effect. That basically, no matter what the problem was, it could be a sexual affair, it could be stealing, whatever it is, the percentages of how that was punished was minuscule by the electorate. And basically, I think that's a very, and I excoriated for her. I said, why spend all this time just to find out that there's no impact? That basically people don't care anymore what the personal faults are. That ethics really doesn't matter. It matters, people care about how they vote. And if you reflect the way that I vote, look at Donald Trump. So I told her she should really resurrect that, but she doesn't want to. But at any rate, but my point is, I think that people don't care as much. I mean, they now have an ability to stay in a cocoon and get the ideas that they decided that they want. And if it's fake, it's not fake. Basically, as long as it supports their opinion, they're going to go with it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Related to that, though, too, is, for the last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of television time discussing the president's alleged affair with a porn star 10 years ago. If the press had paid the same kind of attention to the shenanigans of John F. Kennedy, would he be the, sainted president that so many people consider him today? But there's been a change in what gets reported. And, the media in that day and age had a handshake, sort of hands-off deal with the president. It's your private life, and if you want to do it, go ahead.
I'm going to make this the last question because we've run 20 minutes over time. Sir.
Hearing all these statistics about the fact that people don't trust the news, sort of begs the question, well, why? And I wonder I personally think that the media itself really bears a lot of the blame for it, because you hear a lot of media bashing on the news. You hear people, and I have to say I think a lot on Fox News more than the left, talking about fake news, how you shouldn't trust the news, the liberal media shouldn't be trusted. And then you also have them reporting on politicians and pundits who are constantly bashing the news, such as the current president, who clearly had a strategy of trying to minimize the influence of truth. So I think it's easy to bemoan the fact that the media isn't trusted, but I think the media has to look into the mirror and say, whose fault is it? And I'd like to hear your reaction.
TV, and it's not just Fox, you can watch any panel on CNN, and when there's a story that's negative about either political party, but especially about Trump, then there's this kind of categorical statement being made by at least one of the panelists. Used to be Jeff Lord, and they sent him packing, and now there's some version of him who just kind of makes these categorical statements. And since CNN or New York Times got story X wrong 4 years ago, now you can't trust them to do anything. As if, and so the problem is, I think, it certainly didn't start with Trump, but under Trump, bashing the press has become a key part of his strategy, as you were quoting the Leslie Stahl thing. He spends more time bashing the press than he does the opposition party or governments that are hostile to the United States, and it clearly works for the 40% of the people who support him. And since CNN or New York Times got story X wrong 4 years ago, now you can't trust them to do anything. So, and so the problem is, I think, it certainly didn't start with Trump, but under Trump, bashing the press has become a key part of his strategy, as you were quoting the Leslie Stahl thing. He spends more time bashing the press than he does the opposition party or governments that are hostile to the United States, And it clearly works for the 40% of the people who support him. And whether that'll be a template for future politicians or whether, you know, it ends up not working for them in the long run and future politicians realize that that's not such a great idea, it's something we'll have to say.
Full circle, Patty Chayefsky and Network, and the Tisch family deciding that the Tiffany Network News Division would be an entertainment division and report to the entertainment division. Isn't that why we're all here discussing this right now?
We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it any longer. Thank you all very much for coming.